Welcome to Sleep Stories by Oliver Penn. I am your host, and you have found your way here at exactly the right hour. This is a place built for the end of the day, for the moment when the world outside finally quiets, and something softer is permitted to take its place. Before we begin tonight, I would be glad to know where you are listening from. Leave a word in the comments if you like. There is something quietly wonderful about knowing that people in different corners of the world are settling into the same story at the same hour. If you find rest here, consider subscribing. New stories arrive regularly, and there will always be a lamp lit and a chair waiting. Now, set everything down. Whatever the day has left behind, let it wait until morning. It will keep. Make yourself comfortable. Close your eyes if you are ready, and take one slow breath. Tonight, I will take you somewhere unhurried, somewhere the light is always amber, the rooms are always warm, and the night outside is always still. All you need to do is listen. The train departed King's Cross at 20 minutes past 8 on a Thursday evening in September, and Marian Fell sat in her compartment and watched the station withdraw. The platforms, the gas lamps, the figures moving through the amber light of the concourse, and felt, for the first time in the many hours since she had read the letter that morning at her desk in the library on Bloomsbury Square, something that was not exactly relief, but that occupied the same territory, the particular loosening that comes when a decision long deferred has finally been made, and the machinery of its consequences has begun to move. She had not planned to go. This was the truth she had been carrying since September the 3rd, when the letter from Mrs. Aldous arrived, written in the careful hand of a woman who understood that certain information required the steadiness of careful handwriting to be properly received. Dorothy Fell had died on the 1st of September, quietly, in her sleep, at the age of 72. The house on Grey Street would require attention. Mrs. Aldous had not said more than this, understanding, perhaps, that more was not yet necessary. Marian had read the letter at her desk between two cataloguing tasks, a volume of botanical illustrations open on her left and an uncatalogued box of estate papers on her right, and had sat for some time with the letter in her hands without doing anything in particular with the information it contained. Then she had done what was required, had spoken to the head librarian, had made the necessary arrangements, had walked from the library to the railway office on Euston Road and purchased a ticket for the Thursday evening express to Leeds, with a connection to Harrogate and the smaller line north. 15 years. She had not been to Caldwell Cross in 15 years. The train cleared the northern suburbs of London, and the gas lamps of the streets gave way to the darkness of open country. The September night, pressing against the window, with the particular quality of a September night that has decided to be fully itself, cool and clear and very dark. The stars visible in the portions of sky not obscured by cloud. The compartment lamp burned its yellow gas above her, steady and warm, throwing its circle of light across the dark red velvet of the seats and the small rug on the floor, and her own hands resting in her lap. She had the compartment to herself. This was either good fortune or the natural consequence of travelling on a Thursday evening, when most people with reason to go north had already gone or would wait until Friday, and she found herself grateful for it, not because she required privacy for grief, which had not yet fully arrived, and which she suspected would arrive in its own time and on its own terms, but because she was not yet ready to be someone for a fellow passenger, to perform the ordinary social functions that sharing a compartment required. She looked at the window. The glass showed her own reflection superimposed on the passing darkness, her face pale, the dark of her travelling clothes, the lamp behind her, all of it floating against the invisible landscape beyond the glass. She had not looked at her own reflection much in 15 years. She looked at it now without particular feeling, and then looked past it, through it, at the darkness that was Yorkshire beginning, somewhere ahead, to wait for her. The train settled into its rhythm north of London, the particular rhythm of a long night journey, steady and unhurried, the engine's sound becoming, after the first half hour, simply the sound of the journey, rather than a sound you attended to specifically, the way the ticking of a clock becomes the sound of a room, rather than the sound of a mechanism. Marian had brought a book. She did not open it. She had brought it from habit, the habit of a catalogue who moved through the world with the understanding that books were the appropriate company for any situation, and she had selected it with some care that morning from the shelves of her small rooms in Bloomsbury. A volume of essays she had read before and found reliable, the kind of reading that asked for attention without demanding it, that could be set down and returned to without loss. She had put it in her bag and not opened it since, and she did not open it now because the journey was doing something that the book could not improve upon. She was thinking about her mother, not deliberately. She was not sitting in the compartment conducting an organized memorial, reviewing Dorothy Fell's life with a systematic thoroughness that Marian's professional habits might have suggested. She was simply thinking, in the way that train journeys produced thinking, loose, associative, the thoughts arriving not in order, but in the order that the motion of the train and the darkness outside the window and the steady rhythm of the wheels suggested. Her mother's hands. She thought about her mother's hands first, which was unexpected. She would have predicted that her thoughts would begin with something larger, something more obviously significant. But it was the hands that came, the particular quality of them, small and capable, moving through the kitchen in the early mornings of Marian's childhood with the unhurried efficiency of someone who had done the same tasks so many times that the doing required no particular attention and freed the mind for other things. She had her mother's hands. She had noticed this years ago in London, looking down at her own hands on a library desk, and had noticed it again periodically since, and noticed it now, looking at her hands in the compartment's lamplight, the same smallness, the same capability, the same quality of being useful without making anything of the usefulness. The train passed through a station without stopping. She could see the name on the sign in the gaslight, but could not read it before it was gone. The station there and then not there, the darkness resuming. This was one of the particular experiences of night train travel, she thought. The way places appeared and disappeared without consequence, the journey not stopping to acknowledge them, passing through rather than arriving, the traveler not participating in any of the places the train moved through, but simply being carried past them toward the specific place that was the journey's purpose. She had been carried past Caldwell Cross for 15 years, had not stopped, had moved through her London life, the library, the rooms in Bloomsbury, the careful ordered days of someone who has constructed a life that makes reasonable sense without making perfect sense, without stopping at the place where the stopping would have been most significant. She was stopping now. The train moved north through the September night, and Marian sat in the lamplight and thought about her mother's hands, and about the house on Grey Street, and about 15 years, and about the particular quality of the darkness outside the window, which was different from London darkness, and different from anything in between, and which she recognized, even through the glass and after 15 years, as Yorkshire. The train reached Leeds at 11:30 and stopped for 12 minutes, and Marian sat in the compartment while the platform activity went on outside. The calling of names, the moving of luggage, the particular noise of a large station receiving a train at night, which was a compressed and urgent version of the noise such stations made in the day. She did not get out. She had no reason to get out. Her connection to the smaller northern line was at Harrogate, not here, and the 12 minutes was simply a mechanical pause in the journey rather than an invitation to engage with Leeds at midnight. But she watched the platform through the window, the gas lamps showing the faces of people arriving and departing, the porters moving with their trolleys, a small family group embracing near the platform gate, a woman and 2 children meeting a man who had apparently been away for some time, the children's energy at this late hour suggesting either very significant occasion or the particular resilience of children who had been permitted to stay up past their bedtime for the purpose. She had never arrived at Leeds at midnight. She had arrived at Leeds at various hours in various years, always passing through on the way somewhere else or returning from somewhere else to London, always in transit, never Leeds itself as the destination. She did not know Leeds, had no particular relationship with it, and yet the city had appeared in her journey north enough times across enough years that she had a kind of nodding familiarity with it, the station's particular smell, the character of the platform lights, the quality of the air when the carriage door opened at this specific stop. A man entered the compartment while the train was stopped at Leeds. He was perhaps 50, in a dark overcoat, carrying a leather briefcase, and he settled into the seat opposite with the practiced efficiency of a frequent traveller, arranged his briefcase on the rack above, and opened a newspaper, which he proceeded to read without acknowledging Marian's presence, which was exactly the correct behaviour and which she received with quiet gratitude. The train left Leeds and continued north, and the man read his newspaper, and Marian looked at the window, and the compartment held its 2 occupants in the particular companionable privacy of train travel, each of them present and absent in equal measure, sharing the space without engaging with it. She thought about the letter from Mrs. Aldous. She had read it 3 times, once at the library desk where it arrived, once in the evening after work in her rooms in Bloomsbury, and once this morning on the train platform at King's Cross before boarding. The language of it was careful in the way of a letter written by someone who understands that the person receiving it may need the words to hold something heavy, and has therefore made the words as steady as possible. Dorothy Fell had been a practical woman. Marian had known this all her life and had understood it better with distance. In London, in the years of letters, she had read the practicality in her mother's correspondence as a kind of love, the love that expressed itself in reliable information rather than expression, in the noting of what the weather had been, and how the garden was doing, and whether the roof had been fixed, rather than in any direct statement of what the writer felt about the person being written to. She had her mother's practicality too, alongside the hands. The man opposite finished his newspaper and folded it and closed his eyes, and the compartment was quiet, except for the train, and Marian looked at the window and thought about what a practical woman left behind when she was gone. The connection at Harrogate was a smaller train on a narrower line, 3 carriages rather than the express's 8, and Marian found a compartment and settled into it as the Harrogate station clock showed 1:15 in the morning, the platform deserted except for the station master and a single porter moving a handcart with unhurried purpose along the far platform. The man with the briefcase had departed at Harrogate, with the nod of a fellow night traveller acknowledging a shared journey's end, and Marian was alone again in the compartment, more alone than before, if that was a quantity that admitted of more, because this smaller train had fewer passengers and the night outside was darker, the streets of Harrogate giving way within minutes of departure to the open country of the northern dales, and the country at this hour and in this light was simply darkness, unvaried and complete. She was an hour from Caldwell Cross. She had calculated this on the platform at Harrogate while waiting for the connection, counting the stops on the timetable posted beside the waiting room door, finding Caldwell Cross on the list, and working backward from arrival to the present moment. 1 hour. The number had arrived in her with a quality that was not precisely anticipation and not precisely dread, but something that occupied the space between them, the feeling of approaching something you have been not approaching for a long time and have now chosen to approach, the mixture of relief and resistance that comes when a prolonged avoidance ends. She thought about what Caldwell Cross would look like at 2 in the morning in September. Dark, certainly. The village would be entirely asleep, the houses shut and the streets empty, and she would have to find the house on Grey Street with whatever light the gas lamps provided, carrying her bag along the familiar streets that 15 years had made both known and strange. She had the key. Mrs. Aldous had sent it with the letter, enclosed in a small paper envelope with Marian's name written on it. The key to the front door of the house on Grey Street, the same key that had always hung on the hook inside the kitchen door, which Marian had carried in the pocket of her coat every day of her childhood without thinking about it, and had handed back to her mother the morning she left for London, and had not held since. She held it now in her closed hand, in the dark compartment, on the small train north through the September night. The key was heavier than she remembered, or perhaps she remembered it as lighter than it was, the memory of childhood objects being unreliable in the matter of weight, which children were not yet calibrated to notice precisely. She pressed the key into her palm and felt the particular shape of it, the bow, the shaft, the wards, and found that her hand remembered it even where her mind had been uncertain. The body remembered things the mind let go of. She had learned this in the library across 15 years of handling very old books, of recognizing bindings and typefaces that she could not have named consciously, but that her hands identified correctly before her conscious knowledge caught up with them. The hands knew things, her mother's hands, her own hands. The train moved north through the darkness, and Marian held her mother's key and thought about the house that the key opened, and about the woman who had lived in it alone for 15 years, and about the September night that was moving, steadily and without hurry, toward morning. She had not slept. She had not expected to sleep, had not in fact brought the book with any real expectation that she would read it, having understood on some level that the journey itself was the thing, the hours between London and Caldwell Cross being not the empty time between the significant departure and the significant arrival, but themselves significant, a space in which things could be thought about that the ordinary routine of London days did not provide room for. She looked at the window. The glass gave her very little. The darkness outside was nearly complete, occasionally broken by the light of a farmhouse or the brief bright interruption of a small station the train passed without stopping, but mostly simply dark, the Yorkshire night being serious about its darkness in the way of places far enough from any large city that the sky retained its actual character and did not perform the permanent amber twilight of London's nights. But the glass gave her her own reflection, and she had been looking at this for some time now, not with vanity or particular self-examination, but with the quality of attention she brought to any object she spent time in proximity to, the cataloguer's instinct to observe carefully what was before her. The face in the glass was 34 years old. She was aware of this in the specific way of someone who has not looked at their own reflection on a train window at 2 in the morning for some time and finds the face informative. She had left Caldwell Cross at 19. The face in the glass had 15 years of London in it, 15 years of the library, of the quiet rooms in Bloomsbury, of the walks across the city that she had taken most evenings regardless of weather, which had given her a quality of steady physical presence that she had not had at 19. At 19 she had been a thinner version of herself, not thinner in body, but thinner in some quality she could only describe as substance, as though the years of London had added to her something the girl of 19 had not yet accumulated. She thought about Dorothy Fell reading the letters. She wrote every 3 weeks, had done so consistently across 15 years, the letters arriving in Caldwell Cross on schedule, filled with the careful observations of a cataloguer who had learned to describe the observable world precisely, the weather, the library, the streets, the particular qualities of London seasons. She had not written about what the letters did not contain, which was any explanation of why she did not come. Her mother had not asked. This was the thing she had thought about least across 15 years, because it was the thing that most required thinking about. Dorothy Fell had never once written the words that would have been entirely reasonable and entirely accurate, which were, "Marian, you have not come home in 15 years, and I would like to know why." She had not asked. She had written about the weather and the garden and the roof and the neighbours and the small events of a small Yorkshire town, and had not asked, and Marian had not explained, and the correspondence had continued across 15 years in this form, adequate, consistent and containing, on both sides, a very large and very carefully maintained silence. The train moved through the darkness. The reflection in the glass moved with her. She thought, my mother knew why, and she thought, I will not be able to ask her. Sometime after 2 in the morning, the character of the darkness outside the window changed. She could not have said precisely when or how. The change was not dramatic, was not the sudden arrival of visible landscape after hours of nothing, but rather a gradual modulation in the quality of the dark, as though the darkness had begun to differentiate itself, to show within its uniformity the suggestion of different kinds of dark, the dark of open high ground above the train, and the dark of closed valley below it, and the different dark of the sky above, that was not entirely black, but a deep blue-grey, in which, between the clouds, the stars were very clear and very numerous and very much brighter than they ever appeared in London. She understood that she was in the Dales, not from any visible landmark. She could see no outline of fell or valley, no specific feature she could name, but from the quality of the dark itself, which was a quality she recognized in the way one recognizes the voice of someone heard often in childhood and not heard for a long time, a recognition that bypasses the usual processes of identification and arrives as simple knowledge before the mind has caught up with how it knew. The air changed too. She could feel it in the small draught that came through the imperfect ceiling of the compartment window, cooler than it had been south of Harrogate, and carrying something she could only describe as openness, the quality of air that has come across a great deal of unimpeded ground before reaching the place where you are standing. High moor air. She had breathed it every day of her first 19 years, and had not, she understood now, breathed anything quite like it since. The train slowed on a gradient, a long climb through the dark, the engine's effort audible in the changed rhythm of its sound, the carriage moving differently on the steeper track. Through the window, the darkness showed her nothing specific, but showed her, in the very slow movement of certain darker shapes against the general dark, that the ground was rising, that the train was climbing toward the high country above Caldwell Cross. She thought about arriving. She had imagined this in various ways across various years. Occasionally, when she had been close to coming and had not, she had allowed herself to imagine what arriving would be like, the station, the walk to Grey Street, the key in the lock. She had imagined it with her mother in the house, which was the version of the imagining she had conducted until September the 3rd, and she had not yet fully replaced that version with the version in which the house was empty, the house on Grey Street without Dorothy Fell in it. She pressed the key more firmly into her palm and held this thought steadily, as she might hold a difficult passage of cataloguing that required sitting with before it resolved into order. The house existed. The house was empty. She had the key. These were the facts in their correct sequence, and she would arrive at them one at a time in the order they presented themselves without requiring them to be other than they were. The train crested the gradient, and the sound of the engine changed as the track leveled, and in the window the darkness that was the dales moved around her, and the draught that was more air moved through the compartment's imperfect seals, and Marian sat in the lamplight and held her mother's key and waited for Caldwell Cross. The first light she recognized was the light of the church, not sunrise. It was not yet 4 in the morning, and there was no suggestion of dawn, the September sky still fully committed to its night. But as the train descended from the high ground toward the valley where Caldwell Cross sat, she could see, through the window, the particular warm amber of the gas lamp that the parish church maintained on its south wall through the night hours, a light she had known all her life and had not seen for 15 years, and she recognized it before she had consciously understood what she was looking at, the recognition arriving in the body before the mind, the way the key had arrived in the hand. The church lamp. She knew exactly where she was. The train slowed further, making its approach to the small station on the north side of the village, and Marian gathered her bag from the rack and stood in the compartment in the way of someone preparing to arrive who has not yet arrived and is in the last moments of the in-between. She did not sit again. She stood at the window and watched Caldwell Cross appear. It appeared gradually, as small places appeared from trains, not all at once but in successive pieces, the way a familiar face appeared from a distance, feature by feature becoming recognizable until the whole suddenly resolved into itself. The church first, its lamp, then the outline of the mill building at the north end of the village, tall and square, dark against the darker sky, then the street lamps along the main road, 6 of them, the amber pools of their light touching the cobblestones and the fronts of the buildings on either side. She could see the rooftops. She could see them, and she knew them, not individually. She could not from this angle and this distance identify the rooftop of the house on Grey Street, but as a collective, as the specific silhouette of a specific small Yorkshire village that she had looked at every day of her childhood without looking at, in the way one did not look at what was simply the background of one's own life. The train pulled into the station and stopped with the definitive sigh of a long journey concluding. The platform was empty. The station master appeared from the small station building, his lamp making a warm circle in the dark, and watched the carriage doors without particular urgency, there being apparently no other passengers disembarking at Caldwell Cross at 20 minutes past 2 in the morning on a Thursday in September. Marian was the only person to step onto the platform. She stood for a moment in the station's lamplight, the cool September air of Caldwell Cross, which was different from the cool September air of the compartment in the way that real air was always different from the approximation of it that came through train windows. She breathed it in fully, once, standing on the platform with her bag in her hand. The station master asked if she needed assistance with a direction, and she said no thank you, she knew the way, and he nodded and went back into the station building, and Marian walked through the station gate and into the streets of Caldwell Cross, which were entirely quiet and which smelled of the particular combination of things that small Yorkshire towns smelled of in September: stone and leaf, and the first suggestion of wood smoke from somewhere, someone's fire against the autumn chill. She walked south toward Grey Street. The house was the third from the corner, on the right side of the street as you came from the north, which was the side with the better light in the mornings because the east-facing windows caught the sun first. She had always known this about the house and had never particularly thought about it until this moment, walking along Grey Street at 2:30 in the morning, with the gas lamp at the street's far end, making a long amber reflection on the wet cobblestones. It had rained while she was on the train. The cobblestones were wet, and the street smelled of wet stone, which was a smell entirely specific to Caldwell Cross, or rather, she understood, entirely specific to this type of old Yorkshire town, with this type of stone and this type of precipitation, but which she associated exclusively with Caldwell Cross, because it was the only such town she had known. The house was dark. Of course it was dark. It was 2:30 in the morning, and no one was in it. But the darkness of it was different from the darkness of the neighbouring houses, which were dark in the ordinary way of houses whose inhabitants were asleep. The house on Grey Street was dark in the way of a house that had been dark for some weeks, the particular dark of a place that no longer had anyone lighting the lamps. She stood outside it for a moment. The front was as she remembered: the dark stone, the two windows either side of the door, the step that had always been slightly higher than expected if you were not thinking about it. The window boxes that her mother kept through spring and summer were empty now, the plants removed, presumably by Mrs. Aldous or someone she had asked to attend to such things before the winter. Marian put the key in the lock. It turned with the specific feel of a lock she had turned thousands of times, the particular resistance of this specific mechanism, the quarter-inch of play before the bolt engaged, the exact weight of the handle. Her hand remembered it entirely. She pushed the door open. The house smelled of her mother. She had expected this, had told herself on the train that this was what would happen and that she should be prepared for it, and the preparation was inadequate in the way that all preparation for specific sensory experiences was inadequate, because the sensation itself was always more particular than the anticipation, always more precisely itself than any general category could capture. The smell of the house was not the smell of her mother's presence, but the smell of her mother's absence, the specific accumulated smell of a house where one person had lived for many years and recently stopped living, the smell of a life in its particular form, rather than the smell of a person. She stood in the doorway and received it. Then she stepped inside and set her bag down and closed the door behind her, and stood in the dark hall, not yet lighting a lamp, simply standing in the house in the dark, the way she had stood in her compartment at the start of the journey, and simply let the journey begin. In the morning she would see the house properly. In the morning she would begin. Tonight she was simply here, in the dark, in the house on Grey Street, Caldwell Cross. After 15 years, she found her way up the stairs in the dark. She knew them, her feet knew them, and into the small back bedroom that had been hers, and lay down on the bed without undressing, and was asleep before she had properly decided to sleep. She woke to light she recognized before she was fully awake, the particular quality of east-facing light in a small Yorkshire bedroom in September, which was clear and thin and slightly blue at its edges, the kind of morning light that made no promises about the day, but delivered at least on the promise of morning itself. She lay still for a moment, orienting herself in the way of someone who has woken in an unfamiliar, familiar place. The ceiling was the correct ceiling, the window in the correct position, the sounds outside the window, the correct sounds of Caldwell Cross in the early morning, which were the sounds of a small town beginning its day with the unhurried purposefulness of a place that had been beginning its days in exactly this way for a very long time and expected to continue doing so. She had slept in her traveling clothes. She was aware of this as she sat up and looked at the room. The room was as she had left it. She understood this in the abstract sense she had understood it when her mother's letter, or rather Mrs. Aldous' letter, which had been the letter she received, had said that the house was intact and available, but understanding it abstractly and looking at it directly were different experiences. The room was as she had left it at the age of 19 on a morning in September, the same September 15 years ago, also September. She registered this only now, and the sameness of it had a quality she had not anticipated. Not a museum quality. Her mother had clearly used the room in various small ways across the years, had kept it clean and aired, had perhaps used the chest of drawers for storage at some point and then cleared it again. But the essential character of the room was the character it had had when she left. The arrangement of the few pieces of furniture unchanged, the window looking out over the same narrow view of the back garden wall and the top of the garden's single apple tree. The apple tree had more height on it now. 15 years of September apple trees. She looked at it through the window and found that the sight of it, simply that, the familiar tree with 15 more years of growth in it, produced something in her chest that she had to sit with for a moment before it resolved. She went downstairs. The kitchen was very clean and very still. Someone, Mrs. Aldous, she thought, or whoever Mrs. Aldous had organized, had come in after her mother's death and left the kitchen in the condition of a kitchen that was ready to be used rather than abandoned. The dishes in their place, the surfaces clean, the window looking onto the back garden, showing the September garden in its state of late summer conclusion. The roses she had apparently planted before she left. She had not remembered planting roses, would not have believed she had done so if the letter had not made it seem likely, visible against the far wall, still in their last late bloom. She filled the kettle. It was on the left hook. Of course it was. She had not needed to look for it. Her hand had gone directly to the left hook, the way hands went to things they had always found in one place. She filled it and put it on the range and stood in the kitchen in the early morning and waited for the water to boil, and looked at the kitchen and looked at the garden through the window and let the house wake up around her. Then she saw the first note. It was on the kitchen door frame, not the front door, the interior door that led from the kitchen to the small hall, a door she had passed through thousands of times in the first 19 years of her life, and had passed through again just now, without looking at it directly, because the body moved through familiar spaces without requiring the eyes to participate. She looked at it now, a small piece of paper, cream-colored, attached to the frame at eye level with a pin, her mother's handwriting, small and steady. Dorothy Fell had written with the same handwriting for 60 years, and it had not varied. The letters formed with the economy of someone who understood that handwriting was a tool for conveying information rather than an expression of personality. The kettle is on the left hook. It has always been on the left hook. Marian read this twice. She thought about her mother pinning this note to the doorframe, standing in the kitchen, choosing what to write, writing it, pinning it. She thought about when this had been done, before or after she became unwell in the final weeks, and whether the pinning had been effortful or easy, and what her mother had thought about while doing it, and whether she had known while doing it that the person who would find it would be Marian. Of course she had known. The notes were for Marian. Mrs. Aldous' letter had said the house would require attention, and her mother had known, or had hoped, or had simply acted on the possibility, which for Dorothy Fell was probably sufficient, that Marian would be the one to come. She stood in the kitchen with the kettle beginning to warm on the range and read the note again. The kettle is on the left hook. It has always been on the left hook. It was the most practical possible note. It was the kind of thing her mother wrote in her letters, the noting of how things stood, the factual record of the present state of affairs. But it was also something else, something that Marian stood in the kitchen and held carefully, the way she held certain passages in cataloguing that required more attention than they initially appeared to need. The kettle had always been on the left hook. Her mother was telling her this not because she could not have found the kettle. She had found it, her hands had found it before she had thought about where it would be, but because there always was the information. The kettle had always been on the left hook. The house had always contained this. The house had a continuity, a faithful consistency that had persisted across 15 years of Marian's absence. The kettle came to the boil, and she made tea and took it to the kitchen table and sat down and looked at the note on the door frame and thought about the word always. She found the second note while she was washing her cup on the window frame above the kitchen sink, another small cream paper, another pin. The garden still has the roses you planted. They came back every year. She stood at the sink with her hands in the water and looked through the window at the roses against the far wall, dark red, a few still fully open, others at the beginning of the turn toward the closed forms of autumn, and tried to remember planting them, and found she could, dimly, a Sunday in April, the spring before she left, her mother handing her a trowel. Every year for 15 years the roses had come back. Mrs. Aldous came at 10 o'clock, which was exactly when Marian had expected her, because Mrs. Aldous had always operated on a schedule that combined the flexibility of genuine helpfulness with the reliability of genuine punctuality, and this had apparently not changed in 15 years. She was 66 now, which Marian calculated on the doorstep as she opened the door. 66, where she had been 51 when Marian left, which meant that the 15 years had happened to Mrs. Aldous as they had happened to everyone and everything in Caldwell Cross, in the ordinary way that time happened to things you were not present to witness. She looked 15 years older in the specific way of someone who had spent those years living rather than merely passing through them, the same person with more of themselves added. She looked at Marian with the particular look of someone who has known you since childhood and is now seeing you as an adult for the first time, or not the first time, but the first time after a long interval that makes the adult version of you require a different kind of looking than childhood familiarity normally necessitated. "You look like her," Mrs. Aldous said. "More than you used to." Marian said she had been told this before, which was true, and invited her in and made more tea, and they sat at the kitchen table in the September morning, and Mrs. Aldous talked about Dorothy Fell. She talked about her in the way that Mrs. Aldous talked about most things, practically, specifically, without sentimentality, but without the omission of feeling, the kind of talking that conveyed genuine affection through the precise recording of what a person had actually been like. Dorothy Fell had been in good health until August, when she had begun to slow in the specific ways that some people slowed toward the end. Nothing dramatic, no single event, simply the gradual reduction of activity and appetite that was, as Mrs. Aldous described it, simply her way of winding down, which was how she had done most things, without fuss. She had continued to tend the garden until mid-August. She had continued to read until the last week. She had not complained because she was Dorothy Fell, and complaining was not among her available responses to difficult circumstances. "Did she know I would come?" Marian asked, when she left the notes. Mrs. Aldous considered this. "She knew you would come eventually," she said. "She had always known that." She paused. She also knew that eventually might not be soon enough. "I think the notes were—" She paused again, choosing "in case." She wanted to be useful in case she wasn't here. Marian sat with this. "Did she ever?" Marian began and stopped. Mrs. Aldous waited. "Did she ever say why she thought I hadn't come?" Marian asked. "In 15 years. Mrs. Aldous looked at her with the steady gaze of someone who has thought about this question and has a considered answer. "Once," she said, "about 5 years ago. She said she thought you had needed to go away to become whoever you were going to be, and that Caldwell Cross hadn't left room for the becoming. She said she understood it, even if she missed you, which she did." Marian was quiet for a long time. "She understood it," Mrs. Aldous said. "I thought you should know that." Marian looked at the kitchen window and the garden and the roses and thought about being understood by someone you had not given the chance to demonstrate their understanding, and about what it meant to receive that understanding 15 years late from someone who could no longer confirm it. She found the next note that afternoon in the sitting room. She had spent the morning with Mrs. Aldous, and then, after Mrs. Aldous left at noon, had sat for some time at the kitchen table doing nothing in particular, which was a state she was not accustomed to, but which the house seemed to require. The house was not a London library, did not have the continuous forward motion of cataloguing work to provide structure, and she found herself simply sitting, looking at the kitchen, receiving what the kitchen had to give her. The sitting room was at the front of the house, looking out onto Grey Street, and she went into it in the early afternoon with the intention of opening the windows and letting the September air through, which seemed appropriate after weeks of the room being closed. The air when she opened the windows was cool and carried the smell of the street, stone, slight wood smoke from somewhere on the north side of the village, the faint suggestion of something green and diminishing that was the season turning. The note was on the window frame, the west-facing window, the one that looked across Grey Street to the old milliner's shop that had been closed for as long as Marian could remember, and that appeared to still be closed. "This window faces west. The light is best at 4 o'clock. Marian read this, and then sat in the chair that had always been her mother's chair, the wing-backed one to the left of the fireplace, slightly closer to the window than the other chair, positioned to catch the afternoon light, and looked at the window. It was not yet 4 o'clock. The light was adequate, September afternoon light, honest and plain, but she thought about what the note was describing, the specific quality of the light in this specific room at a specific hour, which was knowledge acquired through long acquaintance, through sitting in this chair at 4 o'clock on enough afternoons across enough years that the knowledge had become something worth recording. Her mother had sat in this chair, had sat in it through the afternoons of however many years it had been, all the years after Marian left, and the years before that too, had sat here and watched the light change on the wall and on the old milliner's shop across the street and on the cobblestones below the window, and had understood, through sustained attention to a specific place at a specific time of day, something about the quality of that light that was worth writing down. The light is best at 4 o'clock. Best for what? Marian thought. For reading, perhaps. The sitting room had a small bookshelf, her mother's books, and the west light in the afternoon would have been good for reading, or best in the aesthetic sense, the light being most beautiful at that hour, having the quality that light had when it came at its most oblique angle and made everything it touched seem more present than it did at other hours. She did not know which her mother had meant, and she could not ask. She could only sit in the chair and wait for 4 o'clock and see what the light was like, and form her own understanding of why her mother had thought it worth noting. She sat in her mother's chair and looked at the window. She found she did not particularly want to move. The note on the staircase was on the 3rd step. She had been going up to retrieve a cardigan. The September afternoon had cooled considerably after 4 o'clock, which had arrived with the light exactly as her mother's note had described it, a long amber warmth that had come through the west window and filled the sitting room with the particular quality of late afternoon light that she understood. Sitting in her mother's chair and receiving it was worth noting, and had been climbing the stairs without thinking about the stairs, her feet managing the familiar ascent without requiring her attention. On the 3rd step, her foot registered the creak before she had consciously anticipated it, the muscle memory of the 3rd step's creak arriving in her body as simple knowledge, and she stopped. The note was attached to the wall beside the step, at the height of a seated person's eye level, as though her mother had sat on the step to write it, or had measured the height deliberately, knowing that the note would be best read by someone who had stopped at the creak. The 3rd step creaks. I never fixed it. I thought it might be useful to know when someone was coming. Marian sat down on the 3rd step and read this note 3 times. She thought about the 15 years of her mother alone in the house on Grey Street, the staircase creaking whenever anyone climbed it. The creak would have been primarily Dorothy Fell herself, moving between the ground floor and the upper rooms, the stairs marking her own comings and goings with the same sound they had always made. But it would also have been Mrs. Aldous, coming upstairs for one reason or another, and perhaps very occasionally, in the years when her mother had had visitors, other people, the stair announcing each of them. I thought it might be useful to know when someone was coming. Her mother had not fixed the creak because the creak was useful. This was such a completely Dorothy Fell response to a creak in a stair, not the sentimental retention of it for any emotional reason, not the practical fixing of it for the conventional reason, but the identification of it as serving a specific function, and the decision to preserve it on those grounds. And yet, the creak had been useful throughout 15 years when Marian had not come, had announced no one arriving except Mrs. Aldous, and the occasional other visitor had not announced Marian, because Marian had not been coming up or down the stairs of the house on Grey Street, and the creak had simply been there, maintaining its function in the absence of anyone for whom that function was particularly relevant. She sat on the 3rd step of the staircase in the house on Grey Street and thought about what it meant that her mother had left a note about the creak. Not just a note about it, but this specific note, with its explanation. I thought it might be useful to know when someone was coming. Not when someone comes, when someone is coming. The coming as something expected, anticipated, prepared for, even across 15 years of its not happening. She stayed on the step for some time. Then she continued up the stairs to get her cardigan, and the 3rd step creaked under her foot as she stood from it, and she went on up. The note in the bedroom was the one she had been most afraid of. Without knowing, she had been afraid of it until she found it. She had been in and out of the bedroom several times since waking, had retrieved her cardigan, had changed out of her traveling clothes, had made the bed with the clean sheets she found in the linen chest, and had not found a note. She had begun to think there might not be one, that the bedroom was exempt from whatever logic had produced the notes in the kitchen and the sitting room and on the staircase, that her mother had considered the bedroom private in a way the other rooms were not. She found it in the evening, when the light was going, and she was looking for the candles she knew her mother kept on the small shelf above the washstand. Candles for when the gas pressure was low, which it sometimes was in the evening in winter, though it was not winter now, and the gas was working perfectly well. But she looked for the candle out of habit, her hand going to the shelf the way her hand had gone to the left hook for the kettle. The note was on the shelf beside where the candle had always been kept. Your room is as you left it. I thought you might want that. She stood at the washstand with the candle in one hand and the note in the other and looked at the room. Your room, not the back bedroom, not the small room, your room. Her mother had not stopped thinking of it as Marian's room across 15 years of Marian not being in it. Had kept it, as the note said, as Marian had left it, which it was. The same furniture in the same positions, the same curtains at the window, the same chest of drawers with the same slightly stiff top drawer that had always required a particular technique to open properly. She thought about her mother coming into this room across 15 years. To clean it, certainly. It was clean, had been kept clean, the windows aired, and the surfaces dusted in the way of someone who tended rooms, whether or not they were occupied, because that was how you kept a house. But perhaps also simply entering sometimes, for no particular reason except the reason of the room being there, and being your daughter's room, and your daughter being somewhere you could not see her. I thought you might want that. Her mother had thought about what Marian might want, had made a decision, across 15 years, to maintain the room in the form Marian had left it, on the basis of what Marian might want upon return, without knowing whether the return would happen, without asking for it directly, without making the maintenance of the room conditional on any acknowledgement from Marian. She had simply kept it. Marian set the candle down on the shelf and sat on the edge of the bed, her old bed, with the same slight dip in the mattress from the same position of habitual sleeping, and held the note and looked at the room and understood something about the form that some love took, which was the form of maintenance and preparation and the quiet, faithful keeping of things in the condition in which they might be needed, across whatever duration the needing required. She woke on the second morning to rain. The September rain on the window of the back bedroom, the east-facing window, catching the rain as it came in from the moor, had a particular sound she had forgotten she knew, a light, insistent sound, different from London rain on London windows, lower and more varied, the individual drops more distinct, as though the rain in Yorkshire fell with more individual character than London rain, which arrived in quantities rather than in particulars. She lay still and listened to it. She had slept properly this time, had gone to bed at a reasonable hour rather than collapsing into unconscious exhaustion as she had on the first night, and had slept with the quality of someone whose body understood that it was in the place where sleep had always come easily and was responding accordingly. She had dreamed, though she retained only the outline of the dream rather than its content. Something about a library, she thought, and a catalogue that needed updating. Mrs. Aldous came again in the morning, as she had said she would, bringing with her a small amount of practical information about the house's current condition. The boiler needed attention before winter. The roof had a section above the east bedroom that had been watched for several seasons and would need addressing. The garden's roses would need cutting back in October, and delivering it in the same manner she delivered everything, steadily and without particular drama. She also brought, without being asked, the name of the local solicitor who had handled Dorothy Fell's affairs, and the information that the estate was straightforward, the house and its contents, a small amount of savings, no complicating circumstances. She was clearly aware that Marian would need to make decisions about the house, and was providing the information that decisions required without yet asking what the decisions would be. Marian found, as she sat across the kitchen table from Mrs. Aldous in the September morning rain, that she had already begun to form a view about the house, though she had not yet articulated it even to herself. The view was present in the way she moved through the rooms, in the way her hands went to the left hook, and the third step's creak registered as information rather than obstacle, in the way she had woken this morning already oriented rather than requiring the moment of reorientation that had been necessary in Bloomsbury, where she always woke knowing where she was in the abstract while her body still adjusted to the room. Here she woke knowing where she was in every sense. After Mrs. Aldous left, Marian put on her coat and walked in the rain along Grey Street and through Caldwell Cross's small centre, past the church, past the market cross, past the buildings she had known in a form so familiar it had become invisible, and now, after 15 years, had become visible again in the way that all familiar things became newly visible after sufficient interval. The town was not the same. Several buildings had changed purpose. One or two new ones had appeared at the south end, but the essential character of it, the stone, the scale, the way the streets related to each other, the way the church sat at the centre, and the roads arranged themselves around it, was unchanged, and was unchanged in the way that things changed by years rather than by events were unchanged, continuous with what they had been, further along in the same direction. She walked through the rain and let the town be what it was, which was the town she had left and the town she had returned to, both at once, without contradiction. She went into the garden on the second afternoon when the rain cleared. The garden was not large, perhaps 20 feet by 30, walled on three sides with the old Yorkshire stone that was darker when wet, which it still was from the morning's rain, and the house on the fourth. Her mother had kept it well, in the practical manner she kept everything, not ornamental, not a garden designed for display, but a garden used for the things gardens could be used for, which was the growing of certain things that were useful or pleasant, or both, and the having of a space in which to be outside while remaining enclosed, which was a thing Yorkshire gardens understood about themselves. The roses were against the south wall. She stood in front of them for a long time. She had planted them in April 1860, 15 years and 5 months ago, on a Sunday afternoon when she was 19 and a month away from leaving Caldwell Cross, though she had not known she was a month away from leaving when she planted them. She had not known at 19 that she was going to leave in the way she left, suddenly, in a morning, without the proper kind of planning. She had planted the roses in the ordinary way of someone who expected to see them bloom in the ordinary future. They were dark red. She had chosen dark red because her mother had said once that she preferred dark roses to pale ones, the preference stated as a passing observation rather than a request, but Marian had held it and acted on it, and the roses were dark red and had come back every year for 15 years, as the note on the kitchen window had said. She thought about her mother tending them, pruning in October, as Mrs. Aldous had reminded her would be necessary, feeding in spring, watching them each year come back in the way that things correctly established came back, not because they were forced to, or because someone arranged it, but because that was what they did when the conditions were right, which they apparently had been, year after year, in the garden on Grey Street. She found the fifth note here, on the garden wall, attached with the same pin and the same cream paper, at the level of the top of the rose bushes. The garden still has the roses you planted. They came back every year. She had already read this note. It was the same note she had found on the kitchen window frame. She looked at it again and understood that she had misread the situation. This was the original note, here on the garden wall beside the roses, and the one in the kitchen was a copy, placed where she would be likely to see it before she came outside. Her mother had written it twice, to make sure she would find it. She stood beside the roses in the September garden and looked at the note and thought about the writing of it twice, the care of making sure she would not miss it, the trouble taken to ensure Marian would know about the roses, would know that they had come back, would know that her mother had watched them come back every year for 15 years. She reached out and touched one of the roses, the outermost petal of the closest bloom, very lightly, the way you touched something that was both ordinary and not ordinary at the same time. She asked Mrs. Aldous about the notes on the third morning. Not what the notes said. She had been reading them and thinking about them alone, and was not yet ready to share the specific contents. But she asked about the fact of them, whether Mrs. Aldous had known, whether her mother had mentioned what she was doing. Mrs. Aldous was quiet for a moment. She was quiet in the thoughtful way, rather than the reluctant way, the quiet of someone searching their memory with genuine care, rather than someone deciding how much to say. She mentioned it once, she said. This was last spring. She said she was writing some notes for the house. She said she wanted the house to be, she paused, remembering the exact word, useful. She wanted the house to be useful when you came. She looked at Marian. She didn't say if you came. She said when. Marian thought about this. She knew I'd come eventually, Marian said, even though I hadn't in 15 years. Mrs. Aldous looked at her with the steady gaze that was her most characteristic expression. She knew you would come when there was a reason you had to, she said carefully. She understood that you had reasons for not coming that were, she paused again, sufficient to you. She didn't hold that, but she thought that when the reason to come was strong enough, you would. The reason being her death, Marian said. Yes, Mrs. Aldous said, without inflection, as a person stated a fact they were neither pleased nor displeased by, simply acknowledging its accuracy. Marian sat with this for a moment. She asked me once why I hadn't come, she said. In the letters, I mean. She never asked. Mrs. Aldous nodded slowly. That was deliberate, she said. She told me she had decided not to ask because she thought asking might make it harder for you to come when you were ready. She thought if you felt you owed an explanation, you might keep finding the explanation inadequate and therefore keep not coming. Marian looked at her. That is, she stopped. That is very, she stopped again. That is very like her, Mrs. Aldous said, providing the ending Marian had been reaching toward. Yes, Marian said, that is very like her. They sat in the kitchen in the September morning, the rain having returned in the night and continuing into the day, and the kitchen was warm from the range, and outside the window the garden was grey and wet, and the roses against the south wall were dark with the rain. Marian thought about the strategy of it, the deliberate choice not to ask, made from the understanding that asking would make the situation harder rather than easier, the long patience of maintaining a correspondence across 15 years without asking the question that was most present, because asking it would be the wrong instrument for the situation. Her mother applying her characteristic practicality not to the kettle hook or the garden or the creak in the stair, but to the management of a relationship across a long distance and a long silence. She was still using the wrong instrument, Marian thought, even in the letters. She should have come. She had come. She was here now. Mrs. Aldous poured more tea, and they sat together in the warm kitchen, and outside the rain continued on the garden and on the roses. She wrote to the library on the third day. She had been forming the letter in her mind since the first morning, since, in fact, the kitchen and the kettle hook and the morning light in the east-facing bedroom and the smell of the house when she had stepped inside in the dark after arriving from the train. She had been forming it in the way that some decisions formed themselves, not through deliberate reasoning, but through the accumulation of small certainties, each one insufficient on its own, but collectively producing something that had the quality of understanding rather than resolution. The letter was not long. She was not in the habit of long letters. Her professional correspondence was precise and contained, the practice of a cataloguer for whom excess verbiage was a form of inaccuracy, and this letter, while personal rather than professional, was governed by the same instinct. She said that she would not be returning to her position at the library at the agreed date, that family circumstances required her to remain in Yorkshire for an indefinite period, and that she was sorry for the inconvenience and grateful for the years of good working conditions the library had provided. She read it back and found it accurate, if not complete, which was the best she could do for the moment. She would need work in Caldwell Cross. This was a practical reality she had begun to consider alongside the less practical considerations of the past 3 days, the notes and the roses and the creak in the stair and the quality of the light at 4 o'clock in the west window of the sitting room, and what it meant that her body had oriented itself to this house on the first morning and not required the daily reorientation that Bloomsbury required. She needed income. She had some savings, not enough for indefinite Yorkshire life, but enough for a period of arrangement. There was a small lending library in Caldwell Cross, she knew, though she had not been to it since childhood. Whether it required a cataloguer she did not know. There might be other work involving books, estate libraries, private collections. She had skills that were not exclusively located in the specific library on Bloomsbury Square, skills that she carried with her, that were hers regardless of where she was. She walked to the post office on Grey Street. It had moved, she found, from the position she remembered to a location 2 doors further north, the building it had occupied now being a wool shop, which she registered as one of the changes that 15 years produced in a small town, and posted the letter. On the walk back she passed the church and went into the churchyard, which she had not yet done, and found her mother's grave, the stones simple and new, the earth still dark around it, the name and the dates in the plain lettering that Dorothy Fell would have chosen if she had been consulted, which she presumably had been. She stood at the grave for some time. She did not have the words that people were sometimes understood to have at graves, the things left unsaid, gathered and offered now that the person was present in a form that could not respond. She did not feel the lack of these words particularly. What she felt, standing at the grave in the Caldwell Cross churchyard in the September afternoon, was simply that she was here, and that being here was the thing she had not done for 15 years, and that being here now, even at this particular form of here, was better than not being here. She walked back to the house on Grey Street and found, on the mantelpiece in the sitting room, a note she had not previously noticed. The note on the mantelpiece was different from the others. The others had been about the house, the kettle, the window light, the stair, the room, the roses, practical informations, specific and useful, in the form that her mother had always offered information, which was without commentary and without the request that the information be received in any particular way. This note had her name on it, not on the outside of a folded piece of paper. The note was not folded, was written on the same cream paper as the others, and pinned in the same way to the mantelpiece's edge, but above the text, before the note's content, in a slightly larger version of her mother's handwriting, the single word, Marian. She stood at the mantelpiece and read it. Marian. The fire has not been lit since February. The chimney was swept in March and should draw properly. The wood is in the outhouse, which you will know. Use it when you need it. The house gets cold in October. She read this 3 times. Marian, her name at the top. The only note that addressed her directly rather than simply providing information into the house's general air. The others could have been left for anyone coming into the house, for Mrs. Aldous, for a prospective buyer, for any person who needed to know about the kettle hook or the window light or the creak in the stair. This one was for Marian. It assumed her presence beyond the first day, beyond the immediate necessities of arriving and orienting herself. It assumed that she would be here in October. It assumed she would need the fire. The house gets cold in October. Her mother had known, or had chosen to act as though she knew, which for Dorothy Fell was the same thing, that Marian would still be in the house in October. Had thought about the fire not being lit since February, had thought about the chimney and the wood in the outhouse, had thought about Marian in October in the house, and the house getting cold, and Marian needing to know how to address this. She was not coming for a week and leaving. She was staying. Her mother had known this, had prepared the house for it, had left a note not just about the practical items of immediate arrival, but about the practical items of continued residence, of a winter approaching in a house that had not been lived in since September the 1st, and that would need attending to before October. The outhouse. The wood was in the outhouse. She had known this at 19, had carried enough wood from the outhouse to the kitchen and the sitting room in the winters of her first 19 years to know exactly where the wood was and how much there typically was and how it was best brought in. She went to the back door and out through the garden to the small stone outhouse at the garden's far corner, passing the roses on her way, and opened the outhouse door and found the wood stacked exactly as it had always been stacked, in the same orderly rows against the same wall, cut to the same lengths, covered with the same piece of oilcloth against the damp. She stood in the outhouse doorway in the September afternoon and looked at the wood that her mother had cut and stacked for a winter she had not lived to see. She brought 3 armloads in and stacked them beside the sitting room fireplace. She was in the sitting room at 4 o'clock. She had not planned it, had not sat down at 3:30 in order to be present for the light that her mother's note had described. She had been in the sitting room for some time before 4 o'clock, doing the quiet, undemanding work of the afternoon, which had been simply being in the room, sitting in her mother's chair, doing very little beyond existing in the space, which was something she was becoming more accustomed to than she had been in the first days. The London imperative of always doing something productive, gradually releasing its hold in the particular way it released its hold in houses that did not require constant productivity of their inhabitants. The light changed at 3:45, not dramatically. It was September, and dramatic light change was more a thing of the summer solstice than the equinox, the long golden slant of midsummer having already given way to the somewhat more modest offerings of the September sun. But the light changed in the sitting room at 3:45 in the specific way of a room whose occupant knew it well enough to notice the angle shifting as the sun moved past a certain point in its descent toward the western horizon, and the quality of the light, which had been the ordinary quality of afternoon light in a west-facing room, becoming something distinguishable from ordinary. At 4 o'clock exactly, it was what her mother's note had called best. She sat in her mother's chair and received it. The light came through the west window, the same window where the note had been pinned, and fell across the room with the particular warmth of autumn afternoon light at its most amber, the gold of it deeper than summer gold, the quality of it more finite, more aware of its own brief duration. It touched the mantelpiece and the small mirror above it, and the shelf of her mother's books, and the 2 chairs and the floor, and it touched Marian, sitting in her mother's chair, and she sat in it and let it. She thought. She sat here. Dorothy Fell had sat in this chair at 4 o'clock and watched this light. On how many September afternoons? On how many of all the October and November and March afternoons that the light would have been different, less amber, more grey? And how many June afternoons when the light would have had an entirely different quality, more plentiful, less particular? But specifically on September afternoons at 4 o'clock, this quality of light. She had sat here and known about the light and had thought it worth noting. Marian sat in the chair and the light moved very slowly, the way afternoon light always moved, which was with the patience of something that had all the time there was and intended to use it properly. She watched it move across the floor, the exact angle of its movement, the rate at which the shadow at the window's edge crept eastward across the old boards, and found that watching it was something she could do without difficulty, without the London restlessness that had made sitting without purpose in London rooms feel like a failure of productivity. Here it was, simply sitting. Here the light moved across the floor of the house on Grey Street, and she watched it move, and the watching was sufficient. At 4:30, the light had changed to something different, still present, still warm, but lower and more directed, the amber deepening toward the amber of actual evening. She stayed in the chair until it went. She found the 5th note on the 4th morning, and it was the one she had not expected. She had by now formed a map of the notes in her mind: the kitchen door frame, the kitchen window, the sitting room window, the staircase 3rd step, the bedroom shelf, and had understood that her mother had placed them at the points where Marian's body would naturally pause or arrive or require information. The notes organized not by her mother's own logic, but by the logic of Marian's movement through the house, placed for the person rather than for the system. This one was in the garden at the very far end, where the south wall turned to become the east wall, making a small sheltered corner that the garden's afternoon sun reached last and left last. She had been to the garden several times, but had not been to this corner specifically, had not walked the full perimeter of the walls. She walked it on the 4th morning, the September day dry and cool, with the quality of early autumn mornings that had something of both seasons in them, the summer's warmth still in the stone of the walls, but the air itself carrying the first real suggestion of the cold that was coming. She walked along the south wall, past the roses, and turned the corner to the east wall. The note was pinned to the mortar between 2 stones at approximately eye level, a different technique from the others, which had used door frames and window frames as support, but the same cream paper and the same pin, the same small, steady handwriting. She had to step close to the wall to read it. "I knew you would come back, I just didn't know when." She stood at the wall and read it twice. The corner was quiet, the garden was quiet. Caldwell Cross was doing what it did in the early mornings of weekdays, which was the ordinary business of its own life. She could hear, at a distance, the sounds of the street, the particular sounds of a small town's morning, which were different from any city's morning sounds in the way that specificity was always different from scale. "I knew you would come back." Her mother had known, had written it down, had pinned it to the wall in the far corner of the garden, where Marian would only find it if she walked the full perimeter, if she went all the way to the end, if she was here long enough and present enough to move through the entire space rather than just the immediate necessities of it. I just didn't know when, the honesty of the when, not when you were ready, not when you had sorted out whatever needed sorting, not when you had become whoever you needed to become in London, simply when, the acknowledgement that the timing was not known, that the when had been a question with no answer available to either of them across 15 years of correspondence that had never addressed the question directly. But the coming had never been in question for Dorothy Fell, only the when. Marian stood at the wall and pressed her hand flat against the stone beside the note, the September stone, cool and slightly rough under her palm, the specific texture of old Yorkshire wallstone that she had pressed her hand against as a child and had not pressed against in 15 years and was pressing against now. She said nothing. There was nothing to say that the being there did not already say. On the 5th day she began to go through her mother's things. Not the furniture or the larger objects of the house. Those were not requiring immediate attention, and she had no desire to rearrange them or remove them, had in fact found that living among them was the particular form of company the house offered. The presence of the objects her mother had chosen and arranged, constituting a kind of low-level conversation with the person who had chosen and arranged them. She began with the practical things, the papers, the correspondence, the small administrative accumulation of a long life conducted in one place. Her mother had been orderly. Marian had expected this and found it confirmed. The papers in the small writing desk in the corner of the sitting room were arranged with the logical tidiness of someone who had always known where things were and had maintained this knowledge through consistent organization rather than through the kind of heroic periodic sorting that less orderly people required. Bills in one section, letters in another, official documents in a third, each section labeled in the same small, steady handwriting as the notes throughout the house. The letters from Marian were in the lowest drawer of the desk, tied with a thin ribbon and arranged in date order. She found them while looking for something else entirely, the address of the solicitor that Mrs. Aldous had mentioned, and opened the drawer and saw them and recognized them by the handwriting on the envelopes, which was her own handwriting across 15 years, the early letters showing the slightly less settled version of it, and the recent ones the version she used daily at the library. She did not take them out. She looked at them in the drawer for a moment, the ribbon-bound stack of them, perhaps 60 letters over 15 years, arriving in Caldwell Cross 3 weeks apart, received and kept and arranged in the careful order of someone for whom the letters mattered enough to preserve them properly. She closed the drawer. She found the solicitor's address in another section of the desk and wrote it down and made a note to contact him the following week. She was not yet ready to make formal decisions about the house, was not yet ready to convert the understanding that was forming in her into the legal and administrative actions that would make it permanent. But the understanding was forming. In the afternoon she sat in her mother's chair at 4 o'clock and watched the light and thought about the letters in the drawer. 60 letters, 3 weeks apart, 15 years. Her mother had kept every one. She had kept every letter from Caldwell Cross too, had a bundle of them in the rooms in Bloomsbury, in the lower drawer of the chest in her bedroom, the same careful order, the same consistency of receipt and preservation. She had kept them without thinking about what it meant to keep them, in the way one kept things that mattered without necessarily examining the mattering. The letters had been the form their relationship took across 15 years, not the form either of them would have chosen perhaps, but the form available to them, and the form they had both maintained faithfully, with the particular faithfulness of two people who understood, however much remained unsaid between them, that the correspondence itself was a kind of keeping of each other across the distance, across the years. She sat in the chair, and the 4 o'clock light moved across the floor, and she kept still in it. Mrs. Aldous came on the 5th afternoon, which was not her usual visiting time, and sat in the kitchen, with the quality of someone who has something specific to say and is finding the right moment to say it. Marian made tea and waited, because she had learnt across 5 days that waiting was the correct approach to Mrs. Aldous when Mrs. Aldous had something specific to say, and that the something specific always arrived when it was ready and not before. "There is a position," Mrs. Aldous said eventually, "at the lending library. Not a large position, 2 days a week, perhaps 3. Mr. Norris, who has been managing it, is unwell, and it will require someone with some library knowledge." She looked at Marian with the direct gaze that was her characteristic expression, neither asking nor assuming, simply presenting information. Marian considered this. 2 days, perhaps 3, she said. "To begin with," Mrs. Aldous said, "the library is," she chose her word, "underorganized. It has been underorganized for some years. Someone with the right skills could do considerably more with it than 2 days a week, if they were interested." Marian thought about the Caldwell Cross lending library as she had known it at 19, a small room above the post office's former location, which meant it was now presumably in the building above the wool shop, a collection of perhaps 400 volumes arranged with the cheerful imprecision of a collection no one had catalogued properly since its establishment. She thought about what she would do with it given time and attention. She would begin with the catalogue, she thought. The catalogue first, always the catalogue. You could not know what you had or how to find it until you had recorded it properly, and recording it properly was the foundation on which everything else was built. "I'd like to speak with Mr. Norris," she said. Mrs. Aldous nodded with the expression of someone whose expectation has been confirmed. "I thought you might," she said. "He's available most mornings. I'll send word that you'll call." After Mrs. Aldous left, Marian sat for some time at the kitchen table. The September afternoon outside the kitchen window was grey and cool, the garden visible in its post-rain state, the roses against the south wall dark with moisture and very still in the absence of wind. She thought about the library and about the catalogue it presumably did not have, and about what a proper catalogue of 400 volumes would require, and how long it would take, and what it would produce, which was a library that could be used properly, that people could navigate without needing to know in advance where things were. She thought about living in the house on Grey Street through a winter, which would be cold in October as her mother's note had said, and which would require wood from the outhouse, and the fire in the sitting room, and the particular indoor warmth of a small house in a Yorkshire winter. She thought about spring, and the roses coming back against the south wall. She went to the writing desk in the sitting room and found a piece of paper and a pen, and wrote to the library in Bloomsbury to arrange for the collection of her personal effects from her room there, and then sat for a moment with the letter in her hand before folding it. She was staying. She had known this since the first morning, since the kettle hook and the east-facing light, but she was writing it down now in the form of a letter, which made it the kind of thing that would have consequences in the world, rather than simply in her own understanding of herself. She folded the letter and set it aside to post in the morning. She woke on the 6th morning to the first real autumn cold, not the autumnal coolness of the previous days, which had been the coolness of September mornings that still retained the memory of summer somewhere in them, the cold arriving tentatively rather than with conviction. This was different. The temperature in the bedroom when she woke was genuinely cold, the kind of cold that came when the season had made up its mind, and outside the east-facing window the sky was a clear pale blue that promised a cold bright day rather than the grey of the previous day's rain. She dressed more warmly than she had dressed since arriving, and went downstairs and laid the kitchen fire, the small range that provided the kitchen's warmth in the colder months, which she had not yet needed to light, but which now, with the cold morning present in the kitchen, required it. She had laid this fire many hundreds of times in the first 19 years of her life, and found her hands remembering the process with the same muscle memory that had found the kettle hook and felt the creak in the stair. The range lit well, and the kitchen began to warm, and she made tea and stood at the kitchen window and looked at the garden in the cold morning light, which showed everything very clearly, the roses against the south wall, with the morning sun just beginning to touch them, the south-facing wall already warmer than the air, the apple tree's leaves beginning. She could see now that she was looking carefully, their first definite yellow at the edges, the tree aware of what was coming, even if the summer's warmth had not quite departed from the stone walls. She thought about the letter she had posted to Bloomsbury, the reply, when it came, confirming collection of her effects, the termination of her room's tenancy, the various administrative conclusions of a life in one place giving way to a life in another, would make the decision more concrete than any internal understanding had made it, would begin the process of the thing being real in the official sense rather than simply in the sense of her own knowledge of it. She was not afraid of this. She had been afraid, she understood, of returning to Caldwell Cross for 15 years. Not afraid in the way of someone who knew specifically what they feared. She had never identified the fear precisely, had simply not come, year after year, and had constructed adequate reasons for not coming without examining what lay beneath the adequacy of those reasons. The fear had been the kind that did not survive examination, the kind that required the avoidance to be maintained rather than engaged with, because engagement would have revealed it as smaller than the space she had been giving it. She was here. The fear had not survived the being here. She thought about what had kept her away, the thing that had happened at 19, the particular quality of a young woman's leaving that had more in it than simple departure, that had been partly a departure from something she had not been ready to face. That thing had not resolved itself. It was simply less large than she had allowed it to be, viewed from the present rather than from the distance she had maintained. The kitchen was warm now. She poured more tea and sat at the table and looked at the garden and thought about the catalogue of the lending library and about what she would need to begin it. She called on Mr. Norris on the 6th morning. The lending library was above what was now the wool shop, as she had expected, accessible by a narrow stair on the building's right side, with a painted sign at the bottom that said simply library in letters that had been repainted relatively recently over the ghost of older letters in the same position. The sign was the most organized thing about the library's exterior, which otherwise showed the evidence of years of being managed by someone whose strengths lay elsewhere than presentation. Mr. Norris was 70 approximately, and ill in the way of someone who had been managing an illness for some time and had reached an accommodation with it that permitted him to continue his usual activities at a reduced rate. He received Marian in the library's small front room, a desk, a chair, and around them the collection, which covered the walls on 4 sides in the unsorted abundance of something that had grown organically across decades without the intervention of anyone who understood what organic growth in a library collection required. She looked at the shelves while Mr. Norris made the introductions, his name, the library's history, the nature of the position he was hoping to fill, and she saw, with the trained eye of someone who had spent 15 years in libraries of various kinds, what the collection was and what it needed. It was not a bad collection. That was the first thing to understand. Beneath the disorder was something real, something that had been built by someone or several someones across years, who had known what they were acquiring, even if they had not known how to arrange what they acquired. There were good things here. There were rare things, possibly. There were certainly useful things, the things that a lending library in a small Yorkshire town needed to have in order to serve the town properly. What there was not was a catalogue. She asked Mr. Norris directly, because directness had always been the most efficient approach to information she needed, whether the library had a catalogue. He looked at her with the slight embarrassment of someone asked a question they had hoped would not be asked. There had been one, he said, some years ago. It had not been kept current. She asked to see it. The catalogue, if catalogue was the right word for the document he produced after some searching in the desk drawer, was a handwritten list on approximately 80 sheets of paper, the entries recording title and author and shelf location for the collection as it had stood some 15 years ago, which she estimated by the dates of the most recent acquisitions noted. Since then, by her visual assessment of the shelves, the collection had approximately doubled. The catalogue represented roughly half of what was now there. She stood at Mr. Norris's desk and held the incomplete catalogue and looked at the shelves and thought about what this would require. It would require time, systematic work, methodical, beginning with a proper shelf read to establish what was present, moving to the creation of accurate records for each item, then the organization of the records into a usable index. It would require more than 2 days a week, at least initially. It would require, she was being honest with herself, most of her working time for several months before the catalogue was in a condition that could be called a catalogue in the full sense. She told Mr. Norris she would take the position. He looked relieved in the way of someone who has been carrying something for too long and has just been offered assistance. She found this, without making too much of it, entirely reasonable. The signs of October's approach became visible in the last days of September. She had been in Caldwell Cross for nearly 2 weeks when she first noticed them. The leaves on the apple tree now definitively yellow, rather than merely yellowing at the edges, the mornings requiring the kitchen fire to be lit before the cold became unreasonable, the evenings darkening more quickly than they had been darkening when she arrived. The shift from September's long evenings to October's shorter ones, occurring in the specific daily increments that she had forgotten she knew how to read. She read them now with the particular attention she was bringing to everything that the house and the town and the garden had to tell her, the attention that she had had as a child, which was simply the attention of someone inhabiting a place and noticing what it did, because it was the place you were in, which was the most direct form of noticing available, and the form most readily lost, when a place became merely the background to a life conducted on other terms. She had cut the roses back on the 7th day, following Mrs. Aldous' timing and her own memory of when this was done. The pruning had been satisfying in the way that practical physical work in a garden was satisfying, the immediate visible result of the action, the clear improvement produced by the attention, the specific rightness of doing a thing at the correct time in the correct manner. She had left the cuttings in the garden for a day, and then composted them as her mother had always composted them, in the wooden bin at the garden's northeast corner beside the outhouse. She had begun at the lending library on the 9th day, 3 days later than she had initially expected to begin, because the practical necessities of the house had required more time than anticipated. The solicitor, the arrangements for her effects from Bloomsbury, the various small tasks that a house taken on without preparation required. The library was what she had expected, and better in some ways, and worse in others. Better in the sense that several of the shelves she had not yet examined proved to contain things more interesting than she had initially estimated. There were maps, for example, which she had not expected. Yorkshire maps from various decades of the century, rolled and stored improperly, but mostly intact. Worse in the sense that the disorganization extended to the storage conditions for some of the collection, which would require attention beyond cataloguing. She worked at the library in the mornings and returned to the house on Grey Street in the afternoons. And the rhythm of this, the working morning, the walking home through Caldwell Cross at midday, the afternoon in the house, settled into the kind of daily structure that Marian found she needed, having always been a person for whom structure was not a constraint, but a foundation, the thing on which the rest could be built with some reliability. She wrote to a friend in London, a fellow catalogue she had worked with for several years and whose friendship she valued for its quality of asking little while offering much, and described her situation in the careful language she used for personal correspondence, which was approximately the same as her professional language, except that it admitted occasionally of the first person in ways her professional language did not. She said she was staying in Yorkshire. She said the library there needed work. She said the house was cold in October, as her mother had told her it would be, and that she had lit the sitting room fire, and it drew perfectly. She found the last note on the 8th day, in the place she had least expected to find it. She had been looking at the house with the systematic attention she brought to the lending library shelves, going through it room by room, not searching for notes specifically, but attending to the spaces fully enough that nothing placed for her attention would be overlooked. She had gone through the kitchen and the sitting room and the hallway and the bedroom and the garden, and had found the notes in each of those places, and had thought about each one with the quality of care they required. The last note was in the small room at the top of the stairs that had always been used for storage, the room her mother had kept linens and seasonal things and the various useful but infrequently needed objects that every house accumulated. Marian had been into it twice since arriving, to find sheets and a winter blanket, but had not examined it closely. On the 8th morning she went into it with the intention of understanding what was there, and on the inside of the door, at eye level, she found the last note. Marian, everything in this room is yours to use or not use as you see fit. I have tried to leave things in good order. The winter blankets are on the middle shelf on the left. The household accounts are in the blue tin on the top shelf, in case they are useful. I hope the house suits you. It has suited me very well. She stood in the doorway and read it twice. I hope the house suits you. Not, I hope you are comfortable. Not, I hope you will be happy here. Not any of the larger formulations that the situation might have seemed to call for. Simply, I hope the house suits you, the practical expression of a practical hope, her mother applying to the largest wish she had for Marian's return, the same directness she had applied to the kettle hook and the window light. It has suited me very well. This was the closest thing to autobiography in any of the notes. The note that said something about Dorothy Fell herself, rather than simply about the house's operations. It had suited her. The house on Grey Street, the small sitting room with its 4 o'clock light, the garden with the roses and the apple tree and the sheltered corner and the well-stacked outhouse, the staircase with its useful creak, the east-facing bedroom with its September morning light. It had suited her very well across the years she had lived in it, including the 15 years she had lived in it alone. She was telling Marian this, not as encouragement, not as argument, simply as information, the information that the house was suited to a life lived in it, that it had proved this across many years, that there was evidence available on the question of whether it would suit. Marian stood in the doorway of the storage room and looked at the note and thought about the blue tin on the top shelf with the household accounts and about the middle shelf on the left with the winter blankets and about the way her mother had organized even this room with the care she brought to every organization, everything in its logical place, everything available when needed. She went to the middle shelf on the left and found the winter blankets, stacked and clean, and brought one down for the bed. On the 9th day she walked the full length of Grey Street. She had been along parts of it on various errands since arriving, to the post office, to Mrs. Aldous' house 3 doors south, to the corner where Grey Street met the main road through the village. But she had not walked its full length, from the north end where it began at the old mill building to the south end where it met the lane that led toward the moor, not since arriving, and perhaps not in the particular way she walked it now, which was with full attention rather than with the partial attention of someone en route to a specific destination. The street was not long, 30 houses perhaps on each side, with the occasional gap where a building had been replaced or a garden made over to the adjacent property. The houses were mostly of the same grey Yorkshire stone that her mother's house was built from, with variations in the details, the colour of the doors, the arrangement of the windows, the presence or absence of window boxes in the last flush of their autumn flowers, the small individual differences that houses acquired from the people who lived in them and cared for them over time. She knew some of the people, more than she had expected to know. Caldwell Cross was not large, and 15 years had not been enough to entirely dissolve the connections formed in the first 19 years of living in a place, and several people she passed stopped to speak to her, recognizing her with the particular recognition of people who had known her before she was fully formed and were now seeing the completed version with whatever mixture of confirmation and surprise that produced. "You've come back," one woman said, a woman whose name Marian had known and had lost and was reconstructing from context, a contemporary of her mother's, someone from the church perhaps. "Yes," Marian said. "Your mother would be pleased." Marian said she thought so too, which was true, and said it without the difficulty she might have expected it to require, because it was simply true, and saying true things was generally easier than saying complicated things. She walked to the south end of Grey Street and stood at the lane that led toward the moor. The moor was visible from here, not close, perhaps a mile north of the village by the most direct route, but visible, the high ground above the farms showing its September color, which was a complex brown-purple gold that was the result of the heather at the end of its blooming, and the bracken beginning its turn, and the grass showing its autumn state, all of it mixed in the particular way of high moorland in September that she had spent 15 years not seeing, and was seeing now with the eyes of someone who had not seen it for long enough to see it fully. She stood at the south end of Grey Street and looked at the moor and breathed the air, which was cool and carried what she now understood the air of this place always carried in September, the stone, the slight wood smoke, the green diminishing, and underneath all of these the particular quality that was simply Yorkshire, the character of this specific air in this specific landscape that she had forgotten and remembered in the moment she stepped off the train at 2:30 in the morning. She walked back along Grey Street to the house. She lit the sitting room fire for the first time because the evening would be cold. On the evening of the 10th day she sat in her mother's chair in the sitting room with the fire lit and the curtains drawn and the lamp burning on the small table to her right, and understood that she was not going to move the chair. She had thought about this several times across the days, not urgently, but as the kind of practical question that presented itself when you were thinking about living in a house rather than simply being in it temporarily, whether to keep her mother's arrangements as they were, or whether to make the space more particularly her own through the kind of rearrangement that new occupancy often prompted. She had kept the arrangements as they were so far without deciding to, simply had not moved anything, had operated within the existing organization of the house as her mother had left it, and had found that operating within it was comfortable rather than constraining, that the arrangements had been made by someone whose sense of how a house should work was not significantly different from her own. She was not going to move the chair because the chair was in the right position. Her mother had put it in the right position, and she had confirmed this by sitting in it at 4 o'clock and receiving the light and finding the light exactly what had been promised. The chair was where it should be. She sat in it now and looked at the fire. The sitting room fire was a small one, the grate not large, the room not requiring more, but it gave the room the quality of warmth that was specific to firelight, different from the warmth produced by the kitchen range, which was a steady all-over warmth because the firelight was directional, making the room warm in the way of something alive rather than something mechanical, the warmth coming and going slightly as the fire moved, touching different parts of the room at different moments. She had the last note in her pocket, the note from the storage room door. She had taken it down from the door and folded it and put it in her pocket and carried it for 2 days now, which was something she had not done with the other notes, had left them where she found them, on the door frames, the window frames, the wall, the step, the mantelpiece, the shelf. Those were notes for the house. This one was addressed to her. She thought she was entitled to keep it. Marian, I hope the house suits you. It has suited me very well. She held it in her hand beside the fire and thought about all the notes together. The kettle, the light, the creak, the room as she had left it, the roses, the fire and the wood, and the October cold coming, and this one, the last, the one addressed to her by name and signed by the fact of its address with her name. She thought, she was here. She thought about the 15 years of not being here as something that had happened and was finished, that had its own logic and its own necessity, and that had ended on the evening she bought the ticket at King's Cross Station and boarded the night train north. She thought about the night train and the dark outside the window and the key in her hand and the moor arriving in the darkness like a recognition, and she thought about arriving on the platform at 2:30 in the morning into the air of Caldwell Cross. She had come back. She folded the note and put it back in her pocket and looked at the fire and the room around the fire, the room with the 4 o'clock light and the books on the shelf and the curtains drawn against the October cold that was coming, and she let the evening be what it was, which was the first evening of a life she was beginning in the place where she had begun the first one. And that is where we leave Marian Fell tonight, in the sitting room of the house on Grey Street, Caldwell Cross, in the last week of September 1875, with the fire burning in the grate and the curtains drawn against the autumn evening and the lamp making its warm circle on the table to her right. The notes are where she found them, on the kitchen door frame and the kitchen window frame and the sitting room window frame and the third step of the staircase and the bedroom shelf and the storage room door, all of them still in place, pinned where Dorothy Fell pinned them, in the positions she chose for them, because she knew her daughter and knew how her daughter moved through a house and placed the notes at the exact points where Marian's body would pause or arrive or need to know something. The notes will stay where they are. They are part of the house now. The last note is in Marian's pocket, folded. It will stay there for some time. The lending library catalogue has 28 entries so far, begun on a fresh sheet of paper with Marian's handwriting and her system, which is the system she was taught at the library in Bloomsbury, and which is a good system, and which the Caldwell Cross Lending Library has never had. In some months the catalogue will be sufficiently complete to be useful. In more months it will be finished, and the library will know what it has, and the people of Caldwell Cross will be able to find it. The roses have been cut back. They will come back in May. The fire will be needed most evenings from now through April, as her mother knew and noted. The wood in the outhouse will last through the winter if managed properly, which Marian knows how to do, having managed it in this same outhouse for the first 19 years of her life. Sleep now. The house on Grey Street will keep through the night, in the way of houses that have been kept for a long time, by people who understood that keeping things required only consistency and attention and the willingness to be present for the duration. The rooms are warm, and the fire is settling to its embers, and the curtains are drawn, and outside on Grey Street the village is doing what it does at the end of a September evening, which is becoming quiet in the particular way of small Yorkshire towns that have been becoming quiet at the end of September evenings for longer than anyone now living can calculate. The night train to Caldwell Cross runs again tomorrow. Someone will be on it who is going somewhere. Someone will sit in a compartment in the dark and watch the Yorkshire night arrive in the window and feel, in the particular way of arrivals that have been deferred for longer than they should have been, the particular relief of a thing finally happening. Caldwell Cross will be there when they arrive. It has always been there. It will be there in the morning, in the thin clear light of an October dawn. The stone of Grey Street showing the particular colour of old Yorkshire stone in early light, which is the colour of something that has been in this place for a very long time and intends to remain. The house on Grey Street will be lit. Someone will be making tea. Rest well.